Good day. Last 24 hours have again seen something of a lull in the progress of Ukraine's offensive. It's likely that this has to some extent been affected by the weather, which appears to have slowed down the extent to which Ukraine is able to continue attacks in Zaporozhye region and elsewhere. But it's also very clear that Russian resistance has been much more intense than the Ukrainians perhaps anticipated when the offensive was planned, and higher than perhaps Ukraine's Western sponsors anticipated when the offensive was planned. There is in fact a map circulating which appears to have an American source, which shows the original plan for the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the way in which it was apparently anticipated that there would be a breakthrough through the heavy Russian defense lines pushing south all the way to the Sea of Azov. Now, the important thing to say about this plan is that, of course, if it's correct, then the breakthrough was expected to last a few days. And we're now 2 weeks into the start of this offensive, and Ukraine has made no significant progress. Now, the fact that there are doubts and concerns are starting to appear in the Western media about the progress of this offensive. There's an article in the Daily Telegraph. I'm not going to devote any great time to it, but it concedes that the stiffest test of Ukraine's offensive is still to come. The Ukrainians haven't even come close so far to reaching the Russian fortified lines to the south of where the existing fighting is taking place. And even The Guardian has had an article which admits that the Ukrainian attack south of Orechov, the various Ukrainian attacks there, have not gone well, and which for the first time shows Guardian readers some of the pictures of burnt out tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that we've seen, burning Bradleys, burning Leopard 2s, that we've seen, or rather that many people have seen, and which the Russians have been circulating. I should say that about 2 days ago, The Guardian was sort of denying, or at least downplaying, the importance of these pictures. There was even a suggestion in one article that the total losses that Ukraine has suffered in this offensive amount to just one Leopard 2 tank, but this article seems to go back on that. Now, we had some estimates about how badly things have been going, and in fact, Slavyangrad has provided a breakdown of the number of vehicles, or to be more precise, it's not Slavyangrad, it's a Russian site called Nabrezhny Intel, but I'm taking this from Slavyangrad. Now, bear in mind, this is an informal Russian network. It may be that this information is not fully accurate. I've been advised in the past that Nabrezhny Intel does sometimes make mistakes, but these figures apparently have been vetted by other sites, and Slavyangrad, which is usually very careful when it publishes this kind of information, also, and does its own vetting, appears to have endorsed it. Nonetheless, let me reiterate again, these figures need to be taken with a large amount of healthy skepticism. They could be wrong, but nonetheless, for what it's worth, I will read out what this says, and it seems that even the Onyx project in the Netherlands is verifying some, though not all, of these claims of Ukrainian losses over the course of this offensive. And it says this: 7 out of 14 of the Leopard 2A6s and 17 of the Leopard 2A4s been destroyed. Despite that, not a single Russian tank has been destroyed by any of the Leopards. They have been used as rammers to fight infantry, not for what they were intended to be used for, and that was to destroy Russian infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. The Ukrainians are entirely misusing their arsenal of American and German weapons, which is infuriating NATO advisors in Berlin and Washington. Well, I don't know how this agency gets that last piece of information, but anyway, it's the losses perhaps we ought to be focusing on. And it goes on to say similar circumstances where mishaps, failures have led to the loss of 21 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and 11 AMX 10RC tanks, which have been used as support cover in the steppes of Zaporozhye. Once again, a misuse of such expensive weapons, and no matter how efficient these systems are, Ukraine is sacrificing the top of the line of Western military technology. Already, Leopards, Bradleys, AMXs, Bugelpanzers, I think that is a mistake, and by the way, I don't think there is such a vehicle, but whatever, and other weapons which have been captured by Russian forces are already being obsessively studied by researchers in Chelyabinsk, Moscow, Yekaterinburg, St. Petersburg, and other regional capitals. Models and specifications on these tanks are being monitored, replicated in order to strengthen the defense of upcoming tanks such as T-90MS, these are the T-90M tanks that we've been hearing about, and the T-14 and T-15 and other infantry fighting vehicles. The T-14 is the tank version of the very top of the range, ultra high-tech Armata. It's the sort of tank version of the Armata range of vehicles that the Russians are producing. It has an automated unmanned turret and a completely new configuration where all the crew sit in a sealed and extremely well protected capsule, armoured capsule at the front of the tank, and the T-15 is the infantry fighting vehicle version of this machine. And anyway, so what this site is telling us is that the Russians have captured several of these Western vehicles. They've been shipped to the various design bureaus. They've been studied at the design bureaus, and the Russians are now modifying their tanks, their T-90Ms, and the next advanced generation of T-14s and T-15s, taking into account what they're learning about these vehicles. And then it goes on to say, if the rate of casualties continue, the Ukrainian military will not have enough modernized equipment to fight, as they have already depleted T-80s, T-72s, and even T-64s. However, they do still have a significant strategic reserve, which they are now using to recover losses. So this is providing us with one estimate of total Ukrainian vehicle losses, and I don't think it is, if it is too high, it is not an order of magnitude too high. 7 out of 14 of the top of the end Leopard 2A6s which have been delivered, 17 Leopard 2A4s. Now, the Leopard 2A4 is an older version of the Leopard 2 tank, and it makes up the bulk of the 60 or so that have been supplied. If these figures are correct, and Ukraine has lost 24 Leopard 2s, then that makes up around 40% of Ukraine's Leopard 2 fleet. And this is before the main fortified lines have even been reached. But again, let me reiterate, we have to take these figures extremely carefully. It may be that these are inflated numbers, but probably not by a huge order of magnitude. And the 21 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles is higher than the number 16 of these infantry fighting vehicles that I've seen others claim. But it could be that there have been more losses of these infantry fighting vehicles, in Bradley vehicles, in other attacks. We will come to that in a moment. And the AMX-10RCs, well, I think the general consensus is that they have failed entirely. 11 have been destroyed. I understand the total number supplied was around 40, but the unit that has been operating them, which has been attacking Russian positions, had about 14, and we've seen that a very large number of these light tanks, wheeled tanks, have been destroyed. And I've discussed in previous programs the inherent problems of the AMX-10RC. It has thin armor and it does not have a stabilized gun. So the result is that it has to stop before it can fire its main gun. It can't fire its gun whilst on the move. It's a light cavalry vehicle, largely intended as a reconnaissance vehicle. It was also an effective vehicle for the French military to use in its long desert patrols in Western Africa. But it is not really a vehicle intended for this kind of assault on fortified positions. I'm guessing that the original intention was that the heavy tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Challenger 2s, which have not yet been committed to the battle, and the Bradleys would carry out the armoured breaking through these Russian defence lines, and that once the defence lines had been broken, the wheeled vehicles, the AMX-10RCs and the Strikers, would be used to try to exploit this breakthrough and to move rapidly on wheels across the steppe to reach the Sea of Azov. I think that was probably the original plan, but it doesn't look as if it succeeded. And of course, there's been lots of other vehicles that have been involved. I mean, this doesn't take into account the extensive destruction of Soviet-era type tanks, T-64s, T-80s, T-72s that Ukraine has had, and large numbers of these appear to have been destroyed, and large numbers of BMPs, Soviet-era infantry fighting vehicles, also operated by Ukraine, have also been destroyed. Now, the United States is acting to replace the Bradleys. There's a delivery of 15 on the way, and there's, as I said previously in my video which I made yesterday, there's also reports that the United States is now going to supply Ukraine with 10 more Striker vehicles, as I said yesterday in my video of yesterday. The Striker is apparently a temperamental vehicle. Its very advanced suspension system is susceptible to breakdown and can cause extensive damage to the vehicle itself. Scott Ritter, in the live stream that we did with him yesterday, questioned whether it was a suitable vehicle for Ukraine. He said that even the United States Army has difficulties maintaining the Striker, even in peacetime conditions. He was skeptical that Ukraine would be able to do this in these kind of intense wartime conditions. It's likely that he is right, and it is likely that these 10 Striker vehicles that the United States is also supplying to Ukraine are intended as replacements for Striker vehicles which have been damaged and which Ukraine has had difficulty operating. And there are, in fact, an accumulation of reports that Ukraine is indeed having problems with the striker, that large numbers of these strikers are inoperable at any one time because of the difficulties Ukraine is having in operating them. Anyway, this is what one Russian military site has published in connection with Ukrainian losses. Now, we've also had from the Russian Ministry of Defense its account of what has been going on the battlefields. And it's provided us with a report of the fighting, the recent fighting in Ukraine. And I will read it. Now, again, this is from the Russian Ministry of Defense. I generally find that in its description of battles, the Russian Ministry of Defense is a fairly reliable source. It doesn't record Russian losses. It doesn't publicize Russian losses. It doesn't always make clear positions that the Russians have retreated from, but it certainly provides, in my experience, a lot more information than the Ukrainian military do, and it also provides a fairly interesting account of the battles that are taking place. Now, this was its report from yesterday, and it reads as follows. Last night, the Russian armed forces carried out long-range sea and air-launched precision-guided group strikes on clusters of Ukrainian reserves and foreign mercenaries, as well as foreign-made ammunition, weaponry, and military hardware depots. All assigned targets have been engaged. The goal of the strike has been achieved. Now, it was indeed the case that over the course of yesterday, the Russians carried out another enormous combined strike with cruise missiles and drones right across Ukraine. A strike of huge intensity. We don't have a fully accurate picture of the damage done, but it does seem as if now increasing numbers of cruise missiles and drones are getting through and are doing very severe damage to Ukraine, and of course depleting the arsenal of weapons, ammunition, of reserve tanks and such things that Ukraine needs to keep up its offensive. I've already said that, in my opinion, the decision by the United States to supply depleted uranium tank shells to Ukraine, 120mm tank shells with depleted uranium cores, for smoothbore guns operated by Ukraine's Leopard 2 tanks, to be precise, is Leopard 2A6 tanks, and the M1 Abrams tanks, which are apparently coming, is intended to replace the 120mm depleted uranium rifled shells for rifled guns as used by the Challenger 2. It's highly likely that those shells were all destroyed, most probably in the Khmelnytsky attack, that's the rumor at least, and the United States, which wants Ukraine to have these depleted uranium shells to counter Russian armor, has had to make up the difference because Britain is no longer able to. On that topic, by the way, there's been a commentary in Britain recently that Britain no longer has the capability to replace or even undertake major repairs of the 120mm rifled guns used by the Challenger 2s, and that any Challenger 2 operated by Ukraine whose rifled gun has problems, the British can only replace those guns by cannibalizing guns from their existing fleet of Challenger 2s. The British fleet of Challenger 2s, which is apparently around 100 operating vehicles. So Britain is likely to undermine the viability of its remaining tank fleet by this open-ended commitment it is making to Ukraine. Anyway, let's continue with what the Russian Ministry of Defense is telling us. And it says, over the past 24 hours, and that 24-hour period goes back from late evening yesterday. Anyway, over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian units made unsuccessful attempts to launch an offensive in South Donetsk, Zaporozhye and Donetsk directions, continuing to suffer significant losses in manpower and hardware. And then we come to perhaps what is the most astonishing paragraph in this report. It says that in total, since 4th June 2023, the Ukrainian armed forces have lost around 7,500 troops, killed and wounded along the contact line, not counting military personnel killed by Russian long-range precision weapons and aviation deep inside Ukrainian territory. So that's what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us is the human cost of this attempted offensive. Casualties in dead and severely wounded of 7,500 men over a 10-day period. Now, there's been much discussion about what the purpose of these attacks is. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever, going all the way back to the initial Ukrainian attacks on the 4th of June, that they were intended to be the counteroffensive. Now, Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's key advisors, has now come out and said that it is not, in fact, the counteroffensive, that these are probing attacks intended to detect weaknesses in Russian positions. Now, you can be skeptical about these reports that the Russians are making about Ukrainian manpower losses, but there is no doubt at all that the Ukrainians have indeed suffered very significant manpower losses. You can be skeptical about the armoured vehicle losses reported by that blogger, that site that I discussed just a few moments ago. But again, it is a verified fact that a large proportion of the Western supply of armoured vehicles to Ukraine has now been lost in these attacks. In his meeting with the war correspondents, the Russian war correspondents, the day before yesterday, Vladimir Putin said that between 25 and 30% of all Western equipment supplied to Ukraine for this offensive has been lost. Now, that kind of level of loss, even if it is inflated, is not consistent with probing attacks. Podolyak, it seems to me, is saying this to try to explain away the fact that Ukraine has suffered all these enormous losses, but has so far failed to make any significant breakthrough. And then the Russian Ministry of Defense goes on to say, in Vremenka salient, that's the ledge area, close to Makharovka, the selfless and competent actions of the defending units, airstrikes and artillery of the Vostok group of forces repelled attacks of 2 Ukrainian motorized infantry companies, that's about 200 men, supported by 4 tanks and 11 armored vehicles. In the course of combat operations, all 4 tanks and 7 enemy armored fighting vehicles were neutralized. In other words, they were knocked out. Some of them might be retrievable by Ukraine and capable of repair and restoration. But the attack failed, and failed disastrously. This is what the Russians are saying. Now, note that the Russian Defense Ministry is not telling us, giving us the identity of these vehicles, these tanks and vehicles, which I take to mean that they were not Western vehicles. They were not Leopard 2s or Bradleys. Had they been, I am confident that the Russian Ministry of Defense would have told us as much. So I'm guessing that these are Soviet-era tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that were lost in these attacks in the Vremevka ledge area. So, to continue, Russian troops have hit 5 enemy tanks near Rovnopol, Levadnoye, and the Oktyabr State Farm. So another 5 tanks, that makes 9 in total. In the Zaporozhye direction, an attack by, this is the Orekhov area, I think, an attack by units of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces near Zherebyanki was thwarted by airstrikes of ground attack aviation. Probably helicopters, by the way. And then it says, in total, over the past 24 hours, enemy losses in the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye directions amounted to over 800 Ukrainian troops, 20 tanks, 4 infantry fighting vehicles, 15 armoured fighting vehicles, 2 US-made M777 artillery howitzers, the Star B and D-30 guns, and these are Soviet-era guns, and a Grad multiple rocket launch system. In addition, a depot of artillery ammunition belonging to the 65th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces was annihilated near Novo-Andreyevka. Now, again, the figure that stands out there, and specifically this is clearly intended to be separate from the fighting on the Vremenka ledge. It says that elsewhere on the Zaporozhye lines, Ukraine lost in various attacks over the 24-hour period prior to the publication of this report late on the 14th of June. The Russians say that Ukraine lost 800 troops, dead and wounded, 20 tanks, and 4 infantry fighting vehicles, as well as 15 other armoured fighting vehicles. Again, the Russians don't identify the types of tanks or infantry fighting vehicles or armoured vehicles, which I again take to mean that they were Soviet-based or Soviet-era vehicles which Ukraine attempted to use in these attacks. Now, I should stress that is only my guess. Now, I think these figures for armoured vehicle losses by Ukraine are probably accurate. You can be as sceptical as you wish about the human casualties, 800 troops dead and wounded. But again, inflated though those figures may be, they do nonetheless give a picture of the intensity of the fighting and of the intensity of the losses that Ukraine is experiencing. If you assume that these figures are correct, and I know many people do, and for good reasons, by the way, then it's surely before long going to be the case that Ukrainian losses, which according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, human losses are already 7,500, are going to grow significantly above that number. And that without the major Russian fortified lines having been reached in Zaporozhye and southern Donbass. Ukraine is still nowhere close to reaching those fortified lines. Now, it's not only in this area that the Ukrainians have been attacking. They've also been attacking in other directions. And the Russians say that in the Donetsk direction, two enemy attacks have been successfully repelled in the vicinity of Pervo-Maiskoye and Petrovskoye during the day. And again, during the fighting, Ukraine suffered losses of over 205 servicemen, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 7 motor vehicles, and 2 D-20 howitzers. Ammunition depots of the 45th Artillery Brigade and the 57th Motorised Infantry Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces have been obliterated close to Seversky Mali and Chasov Yar. Now, these attacks appear to be connected to attempts by Ukraine to launch counterattacks in the Bakhmut and Avdiivka areas. There's been multiple reports about this on various other Russian channels, in non-official channels. All of them confirm that the Ukrainian attacks were repelled. And again, look at the figure the Russian Ministry of Defense is giving for Ukrainian human losses in this area. 205 servicemen dead or wounded. Again, an extraordinarily high number, giving us a sense of the intensity of the fighting. Perhaps it's inflated, though we don't know that for a fact. But one way or another, it does seem as if Ukraine has suffered very severe human losses in the 24-hour period up to the time of the publication of this report, which was, as I said, in the late afternoon, early evening of the 14th of June of yesterday. Now, 800 in the Zaporozhye-Vremevka direction, dead and wounded Ukrainian soldiers. 205 in the area of Bakhmut and perhaps Avdiivka. That would mean, if, again I have to underline the word if Russian Defense Ministry reports are accurate, that's over 1,000 men dead or wounded in a single 24-hour period on the front lines as part of this offensive. Now, in the Second World War, when the Soviets and the Germans launched offensives on the Eastern Front, offensives on casualties on this scale would not have been considered particularly remarkable. But of course, the armies involved or committed to those battles were huge and could absorb losses of this at this level. There's a lot of doubt, discussion, speculation about how large the Ukrainian forces which have been committed to this offensive actually are. The most widely quoted figure for the spearhead force of the 9 Western trained and equipped brigades of the Ukrainian army committed to the offensive is 30,000 men. There's a further 3,000 brigades that Ukraine itself had trained and prepared for this offensive. Perhaps a total of around 50,000 men. And it's said that Ukraine has another 50,000 men from its regular army in reserve, waiting to supplement this offensive and to exploit any breakthrough. So let's say 50,000 men for the spearhead, 50,000 men for the follow-up force. Now, if these casualty figures are right, or anywhere close to being right, then since it is troops from the Spearhead Force who are presumably being used to carry out these attacks, well, something like a fifth of the Spearhead Force, 10 to 15% by some estimates, but it seems to me perhaps even higher than that, has already been lost in terms of dead and wounded. Ukraine cannot sustain this level of casualties, and remember again, it hasn't yet reached the major fortified lines. If this continues in this kind of way, then at some point over the next few weeks, Ukraine will have to call this offensive off, even if its Western sponsors are unhappy. No attacking force, it seems to me, can absorb losses on this sort of scale. Now again, I repeat, all of this depends on the accuracy of Russian reports, but so far we have no reason to doubt them to any great extent. Now, having said all of this, Ukraine has not lost its offensive capability entirely. Some brigades from the assault force have not yet been committed at all. There's reports that the most elite unit that was committed to these assaults, the 47th Brigade, the one that was equipped with the Bradleys, has suffered such heavy losses that it's had to be pulled back from the front line. Apparently, there's even some stories that the men of the 47th Brigade refused to go on the attack again. You know, there have been many reports of this nature. And it should be said that there are verifiable cases of Ukrainian units refusing orders to attack because of the expectation of extremely high losses. They've even been reported in the Western media. So there's no doubt that this sort of thing does happen. Whether it did happen on this occasion with respect to the 47th Brigade, I don't know. But anyway, the reports which are circulating, the claims are that its losses have been so high and its men, the men have been so unhappy and so reluctant to launch more attacks that the entire brigade has been pulled out of the battle zone and redeployed to the Volyn area in western Ukraine to re-equip and get more supplies, presumably waiting for these 15 Bradleys to arrive, and from the United States, and that it's not participating for the moment in the fighting. Again, if that is true, it could be that Ukraine, it is an indicator that the burn rate for Ukraine in this offensive is too high and that it cannot be sustained indefinitely. Having said this, it's possible that Ukraine, having failed to achieve a rapid breakthrough, is pulling back, reconsidering what it should do, thinking through its plans. Perhaps it's going to change its tactics in some way, change its approach in some way, and when it does so, perhaps it will achieve more than it has achieved up to now with these head-on assaults that it has been making. Now, I'm not able to second-guess this. I don't have that kind of level of tactical understanding of a battle. But let me repeat again, this isn't over, and if we go back to what Podolyak is saying, even if one can dismiss his claims that these were just probing attacks, as I said, they were clearly intended to be the offensive itself. I mean, it's inconceivable that Ukraine would have deployed its best tanks and its best infantry fighting vehicles, the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys, for just probing attacks, and would have pressed on with them and experienced all these enormous human losses if this wasn't actually the offensive itself, then one can dismiss that. The very fact that Podolyak is talking about the real offensive not yet having been launched is proof that Ukraine hasn't yet abandoned its offensive intentions. So we'll just have to wait and see what Ukraine does, and it could be that, as I said many times, by the time you're watching this program, with the weather clearing, Ukraine has been back on the attack, and it might, for all I know, have had more success by then. So, I mean, I can't anticipate what hasn't yet happened. I can only discuss the information that I have. But for the moment, based on all the information I've seen, Ukraine is not making progress in this offensive. And as I discussed, those articles, even in the British media, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, appear to admit that Ukraine is running into severe problems and is not yet breaking through, and hasn't even reached the big Russian fortified lines, at least not yet. So there we go. Huge Russian missile attacks across Ukraine, heavy Ukrainian losses on the contact line, no significant breakthroughs, Ukraine losing, according to the Russians, 20 tanks and 1,000 men dead and wounded in a single 24-hour period, putting the rate of loss as high as it has ever been at any time in this war, an offensive whose burn rate looks altogether too high at the moment. And we'll just have to wait and see what Ukraine might think to do. Now, one possibility that has been much talked about is that Ukraine could launch some kind of offensive in Belgorod. This is the city of Belgorod, the region of Belgorod, a Russian region on the Ukrainian border, the place where Ukraine has undertaken cross-border raids, which so far, however, have failed to capture a single village. And it's said that there are some 20,000 Ukrainian troops concentrated in this area, but the Russians have concentrated some of their own troops. These are conscript troops in the main. Russian conscripts, as Putin has explained, are not deployed to the main conflict zone, but they can be deployed under Russian law to defend Russian territory, pre-2014 territory. And they have been deployed to Belgorod, and they have apparently performed well. They were successful in repelling these attacks. There's also reports that at least one regiment of Chechen fighters have been deployed to supplement the defense of the border areas. So the Russians are prepared for any Ukrainian attack on Belgorod, and we'll see what else the Ukrainians might do. But I will reiterate again a point I've made in the past. What made Ukrainian offensives, the Ukrainian offensives of the autumn, possible was the very depleted state of the Russian military on the eve of those offensives. A lot of the contract soldiers, the Russian contract soldiers whose contracts expired in August, went back to civilian life, and the Russian forces weren't that big to start with, and the Russians therefore were left improvising. By some estimates, by Simplicus the Thinker's estimates, there were only some 80,000 regular troops of the Russian military stationed in the Donbass and in Zaporozhye and Kherson region on the eve of the Ukrainian offensives of the autumn. Now, beyond any dispute, there are many more. And I've discussed how, the numbers. Russia did its huge call-up of 300,000 reservists, starting from September of last year. Most of these are men with military backgrounds, but interestingly and importantly, the Russians didn't send them rushing into battle. They put them through an extensive training process beforehand, which apparently was only completed sometime in the late spring, around April, May. So these are now thoroughly trained troops, contract soldiers whose contracts expired in August were also called back as part of this huge call-up. And the Russians have a further 150,000 volunteers, people who've taken out contracts with the Russian military, other volunteers going through the process of being trained up and inducted into the military. And as I said, it's a guessing game how big the Russian military is. Some say that it's 500,000 men, others put it higher still, at 600,000. I've even seen a claim of 800,000, which might, by the way, be correct if you include the Donbass militia and the Chechens and various other groups, but it's probably still too high. But anyway, there are multiples more Russian troops deployed in the battle area now than was the case in the autumn of 2022, and that by definition makes Ukrainian offensives much more difficult. And of course, unlike the situation in 2022, when the Russians appear to have had difficulty believing that Ukraine would ever launch offensives, the Russians have prepared this time for Ukrainian offensives. They built up reserves, 160,000 according to Putin some weeks ago, a reserve force of 160,000 men. They've laid extensive minefields, something that they had not done on the eve of the Ukrainian offensives in the autumn, and we've seen how effective these minefields have been. They've built up this elaborate line of fortifications which not only will impede any Ukrainian advances, but which also anchor Russian troops. It gives them a solid base from which to conduct operations. And anyway, the whole situation looks very different from what it did in the autumn of last year. And of course, the Russian Air Force is much more active. General Surovikin's campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been successful. It's depleted Ukrainian air defenses. Ukrainian air defenses no longer seem to be operating with anything like the kind of effectiveness that they were showing before this air campaign began in the late autumn of last year. And the result is that the Russian Air Force is now active, increasingly active, and it seems that its use of glide bombs has increased from around 20 a day to around 50 a day. It's more than doubled, and I expect that before long it will double and triple and increase again. Even now, as of the time of making of this program, even up to this point, as the Ukrainian offensive has been underway, it remains the case that only a small proportion of Russia's tactical aviation, its Sukhoi 34, 35, 30, and 57 tactical fighters, jets, supersonic fighter jets, have apparently been deployed on any one day in the battle zone. And I shouldn't forget, by the way, the MiG-31s as well. So it's a very different situation to the one of the autumn of last year, when I suspect this offensive in Zaporozhye was first conceived. And we can see why it's not having the success that people imagined. And of course, this is having some consequences. We've now already seen that NATO has apparently decided that they're not going to even provide Ukraine with a timeline or a plan for NATO entry at the Vilnius summit. It seems that that idea, if it ever existed or was entertained, has been abandoned. I'm getting the sense that there's been a big pendulum swing away from the idea of deploying NATO troops to Ukraine. This is an idea floated by some people. I've discussed Anders Fogh Rasmussen and the way he feverishly talked about all of this a couple of days ago. But it doesn't seem to have been well received in Eastern Europe, with a powerful Russian military operating in Ukraine. The East European states are not keen to take it on by themselves. And in the meantime, it seems that other plans for the moment have been put on hold. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has even cast doubt in his very latest statements about the F-16 deliveries. He says that several NATO countries have agreed to train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s, but he seemed to go out of his way to confirm that no decision on actually supplying F-16s to Ukraine has yet been made. So he seems to be trying to backtrack on that. And in fact, we're getting reports that the whole training program for Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s has had to be postponed by several weeks to the middle of August. The start point will now be the middle of August. And the reason for this is that there's an absence of training facilities for these pilots in Europe. Apparently the Netherlands, which is the lead supplier of F-16s, doesn't have flight simulators for the F-16s, and nor does Denmark. And the United States is for the moment unwilling to participate in this program. So the whole idea of supplying F-16s has been postponed. And by the way, going back to the live stream with Scott Ritter has pointed out, and I believe that this is correct, in fact I've no doubt that this is correct, that the F-16s that the Netherlands is considering supplying to Ukraine are older versions of the F-16, almost at the end of their useful lives, perhaps beyond what you might call their sell-by dates, and that obviously they would be no match for the Russian Air Force. Scott Ritter was sceptical that even the most advanced F-16s, if they were supplied to Ukraine now, would be able to take on the very advanced aircraft operated by the Ukrainian Air Force, all those Sukhoi types that I discussed, the MiG-31s as well, with any real prospect of success. So it all looks like, for the moment, there's a lull. There's probably going to be more attacks. I don't for a moment believe that Ukraine and its Western sponsors have yet decided to call off this offensive. But I get the overall sense that skepticism, doubts about this offensive are starting to grow, and even in Britain, the coverage in the media is becoming more skeptical, is now starting to downplay this offensive's prospects. And last but not least, there remains the problem of supplying Ukraine with ammunition. It seems, again, there are reports about this. This is from a Ukrainian site called Strana. Very, very good and very interesting Ukrainian site, by the way. though one that is critical of the Ukrainian government and therefore, as I understand it, obliged to operate from outside Ukraine. But anyway, Strana is saying that the United States, apparently unable to supply Ukraine with 155mm ammunition, and having run out of supplies of 155mm ammunition, it's recently succeeded in scrounging some of this ammunition from South Korea, 500,000 shells, perhaps enough for 100 days of offensive operations by Ukraine, provided they restrict their use of these shells. Anyway, it's now been suggested that the United States is trying to scrounge more of these shells from Japan. Now, both Japan and South Korea have very significant industrial bases. They could presumably begin production of these shells. But I suspect that with concerns about the Chinese and indeed North Korean build-ups in their regions, they will be unwilling to part with too much of this equipment in order to wage this faraway struggle in Ukraine, which can be of only minimal interest to them. On that issue, by the way, on that topic, I ought to say that the Russian and Chinese air forces have again carried out joint exercises in the North Pacific area. We see that increasingly the Chinese and the Russians are operating together in these battlefields, and this is presumably going to be the single issue that is going to concern the South Koreans and the Japanese most. And even as one set of allies, South Korea and Japan, looks like they're sort of trying to help the United States with this conflict, another historic ally, Pakistan, which is in the midst of an enormous political and economic crisis, seems to be backing away. They've just bought oil from Russia, apparently the first time they've ever done that, and it looks as if Pakistan, like India, is going to start to position itself as a major importer of Russian oil. And this, by the way, is being done by the current pro-American government. If Imran Khan is returned to power in October, following the elections in Pakistan, which I would suggest is still an open question. I mean, be interested to see whether he's allowed to stand. But should that happen, we can expect Pakistan importing even more oil from Russia. And it looks as if, anyway, the oil trade with Russia is something that Pakistan has decided to commit itself to anyway. The most interesting thing about this particular transaction is that the Pakistanis did not pay for this oil in dollars or in Pakistani rupees. They paid for it in Chinese currency, RMBs. Now, to my knowledge, this is the first instance when two third parties, Pakistan and Russia, have conducted an oil trade between them in Chinese currency. Up to now, it has always been the rule that the dollar is the preferred currency for paying for supplies of oil. This time, Pakistan and Russia agreed that it should be done in RMB. Pakistan has a long, historic, very friendly relationship with China. It probably has a significant reserve of RMB. It's able to pay, therefore, for this oil in RMB. The Russians want to have RMB, Chinese currency, because their trade with China is booming. And of course, if they have RMB, they can buy Chinese goods in China with Chinese currency, which suits them very well. So we see that the convertibility issue that many people talk about with RMB may not be quite as great an issue as some people imagine. And I would suggest that this is a huge event and one which undermines many of the narratives about the stability of the dollar's position as the world's reserve currency. And it's not just Pakistani and Russian trade links which are booming, surging. Another country is now anxiously turning to Russia to build up economic relations. And of course, it's a much smaller country in terms of its global economic weight, perhaps not a very important one, but it is one which for Russians has considerable comes with a considerable amount of political and emotional weight, and that is Cuba. Now, after the Cuban Revolution of 1951 and the establishment by Fidel Castro of a socialist system in Cuba, just about 90 kilometers, as I understand it, from the coast of the United States, the Soviet Union and Cuba forged very close political, economic, and military ties. Cuba became a key ally of the Soviet Union during the second half of the Cold War. And also, the Soviet Union became the leading country supporting Cuba's economic position. And in fact, the Soviet bankrolling of Cuba basically enabled the Cuban economy to grow, and a lot of the achievements of the Castro era, if I have to say it frankly, were underpinned by this close economic relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed, the trade relationship with Cuba collapsed with it, as did the political military relationship, and Cuba was essentially cut off. It went through what was called the special period. There was a period of extreme economic austerity in Cuba. Cuba managed to pull through, but its economy has basically stagnated since then. But now, the Russians seem to be intent on reforging that relationship all over again. And the Cuban Prime Minister, Manuel Marrero Cruz, is now in Russia, and he's going to be apparently the main guest at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, and he's had meetings with many senior Russian officials, and he's also had a top-level meeting with President Putin, which is very remarkable indeed. The meeting took place in the Kremlin as well, which is also remarkable. The reason it's remarkable is because, of course, the Prime Minister of Cuba occupies a lower protocol position than the Cuban president, so you would expect Putin to meet the president of Cuba, but in fact he's also agreed to meet and had a lengthy meeting with the Prime Minister of Cuba. And before I discuss the contents of that meeting, just to say that apparently Cuban-Russian trade trebled last year. Apparently the Russian-Cuban trade rose to $400 million turnover. That's a significant trade for a country like Cuba with 11 million people, and as I said, a rather difficult economic situation, but it's nowhere close to what the Soviet Union was offering Cuba way back during the heyday of their relations. But that was last year. As I said, trebling of trade last year. It seems that this year, trade between Cuba and Russia looks like it's going to increase ninefold over the all over the 2022 levels. So that would bring trade turnover to $3.6 billion a year, which is going to be enough to make a significant difference. And in fact, Cuban-Russian trade looks like it's going to surge, with Russian Mir cards now apparently going to become accepted in Cuba, so that Russian tourists, unable to visit the resorts in the West, able increasingly to come to Cuba. Direct flights between Russia and Cuba also restored. Cuba apparently agreeing to set up an industrial park for Russian industries in Cuba itself. Russian companies, they're going to set up an industrial plant, industrial park, with the idea in part of using Cuba as a base to trade with the rest of Latin America, with the Russians also apparently agreeing to invest and revive Cuba's sugar industry, which used to be the mainstay of Cuba's economy, but which basically collapsed when Soviet assistance ended in the 1990s. But apparently the intention is to revive it back to that level. Anyway, generally speaking, a huge increase in Cuban-Russian economic contacts, and Russia again supplying oil to Cuba and food products, ameliorating Cuban shortages. And in return, Cuba, as I said, will provide a holiday destination for Russians, very attractive holiday destination for Russians, but it will also be the launch place for Russian exports to Latin America. And it's interesting, as I said, that Putin met with the Prime Minister of Cuba, Manuel Marrero Cruz, and he did this in the Kremlin, which is also quite interesting, and we have extensive pictures of this. These were Putin's introductory words. There is no need to emphasize the special, allied, and long-standing nature of our relations that took shape many decades ago. You are aware of the fact that we in Russia have special feelings for the island of freedom. It has always been so. Please convey my best wishes to Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermudez and, of course, comrade Raul Castro. And there's an awful lot of exchanges between the Prime Minister of Cuba and the President of Russia. The Prime Minister says that he was very moved. He says, I understand that you have a very busy agenda and rarely host guests in the Kremlin, but this was an exception. But note, again, Putin's words, special allied relations. So Russia sees Cuba again as its ally, and the reversion to the language of the past, of the Soviet era, about Cuba being the island of freedom. Some people might push back on that, but that's what Putin said. It was how the Soviets used to refer to Cuba. And of course, Raul Castro is a comrade Raul Castro, almost as if Putin himself was a communist leader of a communist country addressing the leader of another communist country as comrade. Well, of course, Putin is not a communist, and he's made that clear multiple times, but he's extending this courtesy to Raul Castro, the head, who is still the leader of Cuba's Communist Party and the real power maker, I suspect, in Cuba, to emphasize how friendly relations between Cuba and Russia have again become, and the extent of Russian economic support for Cuba. By the way, on the subject of mere cards and industrial parks, Cuba is not the only country to go down that route. Egypt has also agreed to set up an industrial park with Russia. Apparently work for that has been underway for some time. And Egypt has also said that it is now going to accept the mere card too, despite the threat of secondary sanctions from the West, so that Russian tourists will be able to go to Egypt and use their mere cards there. And Egypt is another big destination, by the way, for Russian tourists. So, all kinds of international things and events, trading links being established by the Russians, and this against a backdrop of general confidence in Russia about the state of the Russian economy. And firstly, we've had statements from the economics ministry in Russia. Reshetnikov, the Russian economics minister, has said GDP growth rates will be higher than our estimates this year. This is already clear. I won't give a figure, but it looks like it will be higher, and the previous estimate was 1.2% growth in 2022. That's, by the way, substantially higher than predictions at the start of the year already, but it looks like it's going to be exceeded, and Reshetnikov thinks it's going to be higher than 1.2%. And Nabiullina, the head of the Russian Central Bank, is saying the same. She says the economy really is adapting more quickly. Now, according to her assessment, GDP trend is better than the central point of our forecast of 0.5 to plus 0.5% to 2%, slightly higher in the upper half of our forecast range. In other words, close to 2%. And in fact, the CEO of Sberbank, the person who is in charge of what is by far Russia's biggest bank, and therefore the one that is closest to the actual sense of economic activity in Russia, German Gref, who was, by the way, Putin's first economics minister before he transferred to become CEO of Sberbank. He's published an interview on Wednesday in which he said that our forecast for this year, that's to say Sberbank's forecast, is that the economy will grow. It's hard to say the exact figure, but we project it to be around 2%, which is a good result. Within 2 years, the economy will rebound to its previous levels and development indices. As far as the future is concerned, I would say that I do not share the pessimistic view of those forecasting stagnation. Today there are signs that recession is possible. Is a global crisis, economic crisis possible in the coming years? The answer is maybe, and certainly in this case our economy will be affected too. But if the downward trend in the global economic growth continues and we witness no cataclysms, we will see that the Russian economy will continue to grow. It has all the potential for doing this. So Gref says he expects growth of 2% this year, and he says that even if there is a recession, a global recession, provided it is not a catastrophic one, a Great Depression type scenario, then Russia's economy will continue to grow. It will be one of those economies, one of the few economies that will be able to buck the trend and continue to grow, because the internal situation in Russia is now favourable to growth. And in fact, we've had more statements about this, again from Reshetnikov, and he says the domestic demand in the economy has recovered, even compared to 2021. Our economy is behaving quite properly and working. It has responded to the growth of demand with growth of supply. And yes, we're always discussing inflation risks, and they exist, but they are being realized far less and not on the scale that we thought. So what's happening is that as demand increases in Russia, so does supply, because domestic manufacturing is responding so strongly. And of course, Russia is also able to import goods from its new trading partners, China, India, Turkey, other places, so that the result is that the inflation figures remain subdued and better than Russia expected. So the Russians are optimistic about the state of their economy. If they do achieve 2% growth this year, then that will wipe out all the effects of last year's contraction. The Russian economy will end the year at roughly the same position it was at the end of 2021, before the sanctions were imposed, which is pretty remarkable. And if Graf is right, and as I said, he probably has a granular knowledge of the state of the Russian economy better than anyone else, as the CEO of Russia's biggest bank, by far its biggest bank. If there is growth beyond the 2% growth of this year, next year, well, Russia's economy will be growing, even as the West in general looks like it's going to face stagnation. And that, I think, more than anything else, underpins Russian optimism and explains why the Russians are now able to look to reforge economic links with a country like Cuba, for which, by the way, undoubtedly they do have strong emotional and sentimental regard for, and are also able successfully to forge economic links with countries like Egypt, Turkey, and many others. So that's me for today. No doubt much more coming. I'll discuss it all in my future programs. We'll see whether Ukraine resumes its offensive and how that goes. But until then, this is me for today. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing merchandise we have there. We've, by the way, got a new range of magic mugs, as you can see. You can see Jungle Yozep. That refers to Mr. Borrell, and his wonderful comment about how Europe is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle. Anyway, there we go. That gives you some flavour of the kind of things you can find there. And by the way, our merchandise is of the best. It is of exceptional quality as well. And the feedback we get from people who buy it is uniformly positive. So you can go to our shop. And of course, if you also have liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and I look forward to catching up with you again. Sorry for the somewhat snuffly nose, by the way, the result of extremely acute hay fever. The pollen count in my part of London is off the scale. Have a very good day, and see you soon.